And because of that, a lot of people tend to think I'm a medical doctor. So I guess I'm a quack in that sense. Yeah. But long story short is I have worked in the health sector for the last 20 years. My initial background is I trained in the public management sphere with the University of Zambia. I think they call it public administration. And I did that with development economics as my minor. After that, my intention was to proceed into the public policy space, but as Providence would have it, I found myself, my first work experience was managing an HIV program, initially with Evangelical Fellowship of Zambia and later on with Churches Health Association of Zambia. And because of that, I thought I needed to do a qualification that's got to do with health so that I familiarize myself with the landscape. And so I did an MPH with the University of Manchester in the UK. At the time I was doing that, I think online programs weren't that prevalent. But so it was an online program. Then eventually I was like, I still want to do public policy. So I did Masters in Public Policy with University of York, again, in the UK. I'm currently a PhD scholar with the University of Western Cape in South Africa. As you probably know by now, school or learning doesn't really end. Okay, so I'm pursuing a master's in a PhD in public policy, global public policy, basically, global health policy, if you like. I think that's basically about that in terms of work experience. I have, as I said, worked in the health sector here in Zambia and abroad for the last over the last 10 years. Initially, I was managing HIV programs. Eventually, I found myself at the now closed USAID at the embassy right here. I was there for about 5 years doing institutional strengthening. I think they were beginning to think around what they were calling local solutions. And I was supporting the embassy in developing institutional strengthening, if you like. Okay, and eventually I found myself working for a nascent organization in Ethiopia. It's called, I have to keep within the camera. Okay, I like moving around a lot, but I have to be stationed in one position. Okay, so I found myself working in an institution that was nascent, and it was basically a startup called African Constituency Bureau for the Global Fund. It was basically a global health policy think tank that was supporting African countries in their work with the Global Fund. Some of you might know the Global Fund to be the biggest funder for HIV, TB, and malaria. And for the longest time, the African constituencies, which were the biggest beneficiary of that fund, had arguably poor support for the board members that sat in the board to represent the continent, because there's a lot of work that was involved. So an idea came through to say, let's form an organization that basically helps these leaders who are typically ministers of health and so forth and so on get supported, helped to think. And we were doing position statement, policy analysis, policy research, and all sorts of things. So we're basically deep into the data and the research around health in Africa. Eventually, my last position there was executive director for the last 5 years until 2020, end of 2023. So that's basically about me. I'm a twin, so if I saw you or we bumped into each other and I ignored you, please forgive me. Okay, I can go ahead. Okay, so this is basically the structure of my discourse. We'll talk a little bit about the context, why agroforestry. A lot of it is based on my experience, so that you basically just have a snippet of an idea about agroforestry. I'm sure you've probably heard a thing or two about it, okay? I've talked about myself, and the second bit is about, doing agroforestry was an accident. I basically just stumbled into it. I wasn't planning to. I had done all sorts of other things before that, in terms of side hustles, if you like. Okay. But in 2022, I was working in Ethiopia, and there was quite a bit of a fuss in Zambia about ZESCO trying to get its transmission paused, and it was targeting foreigners to supply it, okay? And a lot of people were up in arms. Why would you be targeting foreigners and so forth and so on? But the explanation calmed everything. So they basically said, we don't have a large industry. At the time, I think they were talking about the supply currently from Zambians was only like under 10% of their needs. So it made sense for them to get to the source, because if they got a Zambian, they were actually going to be like third parties. There was going to be somebody else who was going to be supplying, okay? So a couple of us got talking. And fortunately, a friend of mine who was with USAID as well in Ethiopia, and he's just come back, was like, no, but I do these things. So we got talking about what is involved, about the numbers, and before long, it sounded like a decent investment, okay? So you see a little bit about the numbers, and maybe if you're that, I was going to say easy to convince, but I won't say that. Okay, if you saw the numbers, then you're like, okay, maybe this is something that's worth doing, okay? Currently, so we started in 2022 itself, and we have on a farm in Mukushi that's about 170, 180 hectares. At the moment, we have about 80 hectares under plantation. And in terms of, most of what we plant is pine. I'm not so sure I've seen pine, but I've seen these eucalyptus logs, okay? So we've planted about 40,000 of these, generally divided into two varieties. The normal maturing pine, which is about 20 to 30 years, and the early maturing, I like the laugh, and the early maturing, which just I stumbled into, which is about 8 to 12 years, 8 to 10, 8 to 12 years. Okay, but when I started, in my mind, I was ready for 20, 30 years. I felt ready, okay? But eventually, in the last couple of years, we've run into hybrids. And I get those initially from Kenya, so I've driven twice to Nairobi to go and pick seedlings, and also Malawi. You may wish to know, I mean, these are just some of the figures, okay? And I'll share the slide deck. The key issue to know about this is that we have a huge land, 75 million. And currently the sector, agroforestry sector, is dominated by the public sector, which is the opposite in most countries. So in most countries, it's the private sector that has about 70–80% share of the sector. But in Zambia, it's the other way around. Zafico has the lion's share, if you like, okay, with very small numbers in terms of private sector. Most of them individuals. It's not firms, and but I think the sector is fast changing. There are things that are happening that are currently changing the shape of the sector. Okay. Why get into agroforestry? So this might look like why invest, but it's really just why get into, why the fuss about agroforestry. Okay. There are a few aspects that inform that question. One of it is you're contributing to climate change. I think we live in the portion of the world where the after effects of climate change are largest, or they're increasing. And so effects around climate change mitigation is huge. Okay. But we also use wood for a lot of purposes, including construction, among others. Okay. Forests are also a formidable set of fixed assets. And maybe most of what I'm going to be talking about this is going to be around that particular point. They also provide, speaking of assets, they also provide huge opportunity to diversify investments. Part of my journey as a professional within the health sector and whatever else I do on the side is like, and maybe some of you might get there eventually, sometimes it helps to have a diversified investment portfolio. I mean, depending on your skill sets, you can focus. And I know people who focus really hard on one thing and they make it big. Whether it's people like Apple, whether it's people who are sports, people like Magic Johnson, MJ. There are people who just focus on one thing, but there are also people who diversify their portfolios to spread the risks. I'm sure that probably sounds familiar. Okay, but it offers a compelling financial return. Okay. But for the most part, it's a shunned industry, at least in Zambia. You may wish to know that I think KK had a very big vision in this sector. And some of the countries that learned from Zambia, and Tanzania is one of them, learned fast and went big, and now we're learning from them. Okay? So there are reasons why maybe we've not in a space where we should be. Okay? Part of it is that it takes a long time to mature. If you're talking 20 years, as I was thinking at the time I stumbled into this opportunity, part of what you're going to grapple with is, let's say I have my 80-hectare plantation. Yes, you don't plant it over in 1 year. Okay, you're doing it depending on your capacity. It could be done in 1 year. I know a person who has 130 somewhere in Impika. But you're adding portions every year. That's generally how countries that have a culture of planting trees do it. Okay? So maybe depending on your capacity, you're adding 5 acres or 1 acre or 10 hectares or 20, whatever it is. Okay? But it takes time to mature. And there's need to have resources to take them through to that 20 years. I mean, in my mind, I was talking 20 years. But eventually, it wasn't 20 years. It's now turned out to be, okay, it's 8 to 10 years. And at the moment, I'm looking, my new horizon is like, okay, in the next 6 years, we will go to the market, okay? But whatever the case, it needs care and maintenance. You plant, yes, it's a tree, and yes, it doesn't really need a lot of fertilizer, or except maybe to boost it at the beginning. Okay, but you need people who will be working to weed. So predominantly, most of what you're doing over that period is weeding, which, in my opinion, makes it a bit cheap, but it's not zero money. Okay, I'm just coming. I came in this morning from Mukushi, and we're weeding, and it's costing me, just that 80 hectares is costing me around 100 every year for the next so many years. Okay, we also stamping, and that stamping, we're trying to do another 20 hectares, and that's going to be costing me around about 100 as well. Okay, but that's 80 hectares. So that plays into the equation. You have to figure out the 20 years or 30 years, but now it's 8 to 10 years, okay? So that's one of the things that deter people from getting into agroforestry. But there's also a lack of information about agroforestry, the opportunities, the impediments, and so forth and so on. Most of us, if you've generally grown up in Lusaka, the idea of a forest is far removed in the immediate sense of the word, okay? Or agriculture in the bigger context. But there's lack of information about agroforestry. Not so many of us get hold of the key information about it. I was in my 40s when I really had a look at that. So you guys, you are in a different space. And maybe consider this as an opportunity, because I was probably you're in your 20s. I was in my 40s when I first ran into this. Okay, so you're ahead of the curve, in a sense. Okay? Limited forestry skills, I think that's a given. And then ultimately, the picture is slowly changing. And I've seen it with my own eyes. Part of what I do is I would post whatever I'm doing, and I get a lot of phone calls. Oh, can you do that? Can you, So it's sort of changing. I think this is detail. Okay, it's just basically a summary of assumptions about the numbers that you're going to be seeing. And like I said, I'll share the slide deck, and maybe you can have a look at it in your own time. So it's things like, if you're going to do forestry, you need to have your own land. I know people who rent land to plant maize or to plant soybeans. But if you're going to rent for 20 years, the picture is very different from 1 year. See what I mean? Okay, so ideally, it's your own land. Okay, or your parents. You need at least one full-time employee stationed at the land. Okay. I've used minimum wage for Zambia. I think let me see what's salient here. So in terms of planting, and this is where a lot of people are not knowledgeable. There are different ways of planting plantations. You can either do, depending on what you're planting and what you really want to get out of it, you can plant, let's say, 3 meters by 3 meters. Largely, if you need trees that need to grow big, like pine, for instance, you need to space them a bit so that they have the space to grow. Eucalyptus, generally, I think the optimum for me tends to be about 2.5 by 2.5. Okay, so there are 2.5 meters on this side, on this side, on this side, and and on and on. it goes on. There are things you need, for instance, chainsaws and so forth and so on. My time is running, so let me just go to what this what will a plant. If you're doing a plantation and if you're thinking figures, if you're thinking inputs or cost drivers, what will those things look like? The major caveat about this is that they differ depending on where you're doing it from. If you're doing this in Lusaka, labor might be a little high. If you're doing this in 1,000 kilometers from Zambia, from Lusaka, Nakonde, the outskirts, your labor would be much cheaper. Even your land would be much cheaper. Okay, so that's a major caveat. So you will need staff, at the very least one person. Now again, I know we talk about minimum wage, but out there the reality is that it can be anywhere between, let's say, 500 to 2,000 or whatever. So then you need to clear wherever you are planting. This is probably sort of surprising for most people. If you're going to plant trees, generally speaking, you're going to cut trees. It sounds counterproductive, I know. But part of what's in the mix is that these trees grow where trees grow. So if you go into a field and there's no tree growing, there's a very high likelihood your trees won't grow. So generally you tend to sort of clear land, and so that's where the stamping is. Depending on the hectareage you're doing, you will need my equipment or machinery like chainsaws. I do a lot of that. The first year I planted, we did it was around 18 hectares. So from the word go, we had multiple chainsaws. So those just help with whatever you're doing. Then you need, number 8, seedlings you need to plant. You need weed killers, and they tend to do a good job, at least weeding usually. So if you're talking about varieties that mature 8 to 10 years, you probably weed for the first 5 or 6 years. Maybe 4 or 5 actually, because what tends to happen is when the trees grow big, there's cloud cover, literally. And whatever is growing down there won't grow as much, right? Right now, my trees are, they are not so tall, so we have to weed. In the next few years, we won't have to. It will just maybe get down to slashing, which is, I think, number 12. So it's weed killers, it's weeding, it's slashing. Then you need to trim the trees at some point. It's normally about 3-4 years. It's basically pruning. And you want to make sure that the nutrients that the trees are getting focus on its growth rather than the branches that won't be needed in future. So you cut them off to keep it focused in terms of where the nutrients go, among other things, okay? So that's trimming. At some point, you will need to fence. So as your plantation grows and it nears its maturity, they will attract attention, including from wrong people who might just want to come and help themselves to that. So you might need to fence. I haven't costed that. You would need to, when you are harvesting, you need to cut them into logs and package them for either transmission poles or wood for construction, or just the chalets, okay? And by the way, I think these trees that you're seeing here, they're probably about anywhere between 4 years to about 7 years. Okay, so you can actually, now that 4 to 7 is for the normal maturity of about 20 years. Okay, but for these early maturing varieties, these would be about 3-4 years, somewhere thereabout. So you don't really, and that's worth mentioning, by the way, you don't really have to wait the entire 8 years. There are intermediary products that you can sell before you get to the end game, if you like. Sawmill, I think these are about, I haven't costed them, but they're roughly about, if I'm not mistaken, about 100, give or take, okay, 100,000 kwacha. That is, so that's roughly what a hectare would look like. It's a very rough picture, okay, and please don't feel intimidated. I know most of you are not working, but don't feel intimidated because the numbers are very different depending on a lot of things. Okay, so I've tried to give you a picture of what a plantation might look like in a bigger picture, sort of. Okay, so. And you either planting 1 hectare, 2 hectare, 3, 4, 5, 10, 15, 20, 30, 50, or 100 hectares. Now, there are very few people who plant 100 hectares in one sitting. It probably doesn't happen. I think it does, but not that common. So if you planted, let's say, 3 hectares, what will be your annual costs like? Okay, remember, and the major caveat here is that you're talking about early maturing varieties. So if you do 3 years, 3 hectares, your first year you are front loading a lot of costs. Okay, you are stamping, you're buying chainsaws and so forth and so on. So the first year tends to be a little bit heavier. You're even buying seedlings. Okay. Thereafter, most of what you're doing is probably just supporting the stuff that are there, and you're also weeding. Those are the major. So, 3 hectares. First year, 105. Again, that's depending on the details. As you know, the devil is in the details, right? Yeah. So you look. It may not necessarily be 100,000, but it is 100,000 in this particular example. But from 100,000, year 2, 36, year 3, 36, year 4, 40, and I think what's happening in year 4 is, I think you are pruning, if I'm not mistaken. Okay, so it goes up a little bit. Year 5, where am I? Year 5, 36, and that's largely, of this 36, 50% is labor. The weeding is the other 50%, okay? Year 7, 33, it even reduces, because part of what you're doing is you're not weeding that much anymore, okay? Remember what I said earlier on. Year 8 is 18, it's just down to labor, okay? Year 9, year 18, year 10, 18. Part of what could change in the last few years is that, yes, you are fencing, but yes, you really don't want people to stray into your plantation and steal, okay? So you may want to have a couple more individuals staying around the perimeters of the plantation. So your labor might go up by maybe a couple of individuals, okay? But for the most part, if you planted 3 hectares, over the 10 years, your cost might come to 370. The key thing, as you have seen, is that amount is spread across the 10 years. It's not, you're not forking out 370,000 in one sitting, okay? it's normally helpful, are not visible there. Okay, but it's a picture nonetheless. And the key thing I would say about this is that the returns, whether you, so let's imagine you're doing pine, whether you're doing timber itself or you're just selling them as logs, both figures that are involved into this matrix are very conservative, extremely on the lower side. Okay, so here we go. So for timber, and that involves you've cut up your logs into timber and somebody is just going to build a house. So you go to Buseko to buy timber. I think for those adults in here who've built houses, you've probably walked to Buseko to buy, So that's the first part there, the timber. And then if you're selling it just as a log, there's a client who just wants an entire log and they'll do the cutting up and they'll turn it into timber themselves. The cost might be 2,000. Now, like I said, that's per tree, by the way. So that's per tree. Like I said, these are extremely conservative numbers. In reality, a log this is interesting because not so long, just like a month ago, there's something I was doing and I needed somebody to get me wood. And one tree, I spent as much as 15,000. So that helps you put the picture in terms of how conservative these figures are, okay? So let's say you have, so that's a price per tree or per log. So whether it's the quantity of wood that tree would produce for you or just the log itself. If you planted a hectare, your timber might earn you a minimum of about 3.6 million, okay? That's a minimum. The upper part might be anywhere between 3.6 to about 5 million, depending on the circumstance. It's anywhere, somewhere there. So I just put the conservative figures to just show you what I think, to paint a picture of how lucrative the industry can be. Okay, so 1 hectare earns you anywhere between 2.4 million if you're selling logs and 3.6 million if you're turning that into wood. Okay, if you've planted 10 hectares, you're talking about 24 million for logs, 36 million for timber, for wood. And again, emphasis added, conservative figures. So as you can see, it's very lucrative, okay? And when I looked at the numbers, and at that point I was conjuring up all sorts of ideas about what do I need to invest? And usually when you're away from home, you're working abroad, most people tend to just hoard money or whatever they've earned because you don't want to be, I mean, you will build eventually, okay? But there are also risks associated with whether it's building homes or, and you are away. Okay, so there's quite a bit of hoarding that happens. And I tell people, look, I've been there. I know what it is to keep your money. But it's also losing value. If you know anything about risks, anything you're going to do with whatever you've earned, there are risks involved. If you keep it in the bank, there are risks involved. Okay? Including whether or not you keep it in USD or you keep it in local money, there are risks involved. There are risks involved to translate it into a building. Maybe you put it in a building and the location is wrong. It won't earn you as much. So there's risk analysis everywhere, at every stage in life, if you like. But the point of this slide is just to show you that it's a very lucrative industry. We saw at 3 hectares that we spent about 370 to bring it to maturity, and at 3 hectares, this is earning us anywhere between 10 million and 8 million from 370. There are very few things that will give you that kind of return. Okay, there are very few. I can give countless examples. I've done Bitcoin, I've done whatever. You make good money, but you make big losses as well. Okay, what else? Okay, what are some of the byproducts of this industry? So yes, it's timber, it's wood, and it's for construction and so forth and so on. Along the way, I've come to discover that, actually, when you are stamping, you can make a little bit of money out of whatever you're cutting down. Yesterday, I was in Mukushi, and a gentleman, a farmer, Mukushi is quite an agricultural hub, if you like. So there's this farmer who does tobacco. And if you know anything about tobacco production, you have to, I don't know the term they use, but it's really drying the tobacco. And you're like smoking it the way we smoke beef or chicken. So there's fire that is involved. And these guys have to buy wood in quantities. Last year, we were clearing about 27 hectares. And this guy stumbled into my number. And we were able to deliver for them about 70, and I kid you not, 70 truckloads. And that's a tipper, 20 tons, 70 loads. Okay, I won't mention the amount, but it returns, it gives you back for whatever you spend cutting trees. Okay, so you could do logs for these guys who need them for their tobacco. You could also do charcoal. Okay, the first year we did about 18 hectares. I think I had to mention charcoal because we know what it does to our world, right? But unfortunately, it's in there. Okay, if you're going to cut down trees, you will either just burn them, and it ends there, or you sell to this farmer who wants to use it for his tobacco, or you make charcoal out of it. Okay, so just last year, this guy around October, November, the guy says, Josephat, I've had enough. I'm stopping here, I'm not buying anymore. But I still have trees lying around, logs in my field where I need to plant. And so I'm like, okay, let me do charcoal. And we were able to do about 400 bags of those bigger whatever. That's also some income. If you're going to do charcoal, the best time to sell in Lusaka tends to be around February, March. It's the peak point for the price of charcoal. You can do honey production. So when your trees are big, you can buy beehives, and you'll be able to produce honey. There's some sap that comes out of these trees that gives you good money. A friend of mine was working in one of these parastatals that has to do with trees, and he was no longer working, and some Chinese individuals approached him and they said, we need you to help us find about 100,000 hectares of land. And the idea was to plant these trees, eucalyptus. And it was surprising to me when he told me all they want is 100,000 hectares planted, and their key interest wasn't the tree itself. Their key interest was the sap that comes out of these when you puncture it. Depending on the trees you're dealing with, they could be used, that sap can be used for all sorts of things. They wanted it to produce, I think it was paint, if I'm not mistaken. But it's a byproduct. And you could be, other than just the logs themselves, you are making quite some money. At the moment, there's quite a bit of talk around carbon credits. What I know right now is every 10 hectares that is no longer shrubs. So I mean, shrubs is above, trees, shrubs is anywhere between under 5 meters. So if a tree is above 5 meters, it's eligible, that particular plantation is eligible for carbon credits. There are certain nuances about carbon credits depending on the market and whoever is selling, but any 10 hectare planted would, at least the guys that I've had conversations with, would earn you around $1,500 annually until you sort of harvest. So there are income streams attached to agroforestry apart from the main business itself. Just a couple of food for thought. So the industry is still growing, meaning opportunity, right? It's extremely profitable. We've seen the numbers, right? Good. You're getting hold of this information 20 years ahead of me. Yeah? So don't go, okay, I'm now applying. I always tell young people, so a lot of friends, colleagues, oh no, tell us about this. I say, when you start earning, don't go straight to buying a Corolla. It's just an example, okay? Don't go straight, buy land, maybe 5 hectares or 10 hectares, whatever the case. But the point is, it's very profitable. The demand for wood in Zambia outstrips the supply. Most of what you see if you go to Useko is coming in from Tanzania through Nakonde. There's a bit that's coming in from Malawi. There's a bit that's coming in from Zimbabwe. The logs are largely coming in, I think, for the most part, Zimbabwe and South Africa. So we are net importers of these products. So the market is there, okay? And there's a lot of unutilized arable land. There's plenty of land. I didn't speak about this, but I think 75 million hectares of land. I don't know how much you've traveled across Zambia, but if you go to northwestern where I come from, you will move for kilometers and you're not seeing houses. The land is not habited by individuals. It's the same thing for if you go to the northern circuit. You find a lot of land that is not occupied, okay? So the point is, there's a lot of opportunities. Sorry, I think I've sort of already summarized. But that's the long and short of a very succinct picture of agroforestry, which is why you guys, even as early as this, and don't think it's too early, you could start thinking. You end up bank managers or lecturers or whatever. I have guys who tell me, no, but you can't be having side hustles. They distract you from the main thing. That's fine. But there are also people who are like, well, I'm lecturing, but I'm doing what? I'm growing my portfolio. By the time I'm no longer able to, the trouble with retirement is, even if you get a bulk amount, if you've never really done, okay, what I'm really trying to say is, you can get to a retirement age and you're not able to work and you're not earning any money. And before long, whatever you earned in your work runs out and you become destitute. Imagine having this kind of, because if you plant them when you are 30, by the time you are, even if you go for the long maturing ones, by the time you are 50, you'll be talking about those numbers we're looking at. That changes the picture, right? Even like 10 hectares. That really changes. I think the word is financial security, or is it financial freedom? Whatever you want. But the point is, you're sort of earning, there's a term for it. You are earning passive income. Exactly. So it's already, so you're not producing, you're odd. You can't be, but you're just pointing, please, let's cut 1 hectare. It's passive income, right? And in any case, it keeps you a little bit, I'm straying from the camera, sorry. It gives you a little bit of income. So, ladies and gentlemen, I meant to say this in 25 minutes. I've said it in double the time. My apologies. Thank you.